Greetings, everyone. Welcome to our exclusive Global Leading Voices webinar campaign. We are delighted to have you join us here today. Please be informed that if you have any questions during the presentation, you may type them into the question box in your control panel. The presenter will answer your questions at the end of the presentation accordingly. Now, without further ado, we will turn the time over to our presenter, who will begin shortly.
Hello, and welcome to this presentation, which is looking at ISO 27001 and 22301, with a focus on how organizations can ensure that businesses are resilient against cyber attacks. My name is Nick Frost. I'm one of the directors at CRMG, Cyber Risk Management Group, and I'm joined by my colleague Simon Lacey of Oliver & Lacey, and together we're going to go through how organisations that we work with put the necessary measures in place to be able to achieve a competent level of resilience against these attacks. And obviously we'll be referring to 27001 and 22301 throughout the presentation. I think in particular what we really want to provide, if you like, in terms of our own sort of knowledge and experience is ways in which organisations that we feel have got this particular activity right, or at least fit for purpose for their organisation, what it is that they do. So we're going to spend quite a lot of time on looking at, what's actually needed within a cyber security response plan and how you actually develop it. But prior to that, we're going to take a look at what is the need for a cyber response plan in today's environment. We're going to talk about ISO 27001 and 22301 and how that links to this focus around resilience and building a cyber response plan. And then at the end of this, we've got a case study. So we'll go through how an organisation, a bit of background to the organisation, how they went through with looking at what was needed to then develop the response plan. And that's one of the key areas that we're going to focus on here, is understanding and how you understand your organisation and how that links to the cybersecurity resilience and response requirements. And then we'll have question and answers. And as per the previous presentation Simon and I gave last year, any questions we don't manage to cover, we will provide our responses, and then our colleagues at BCB will then provide that to you. Before we get into the actual meat of the agenda, I wanted just to cover, and I know that we're all aware of this, but I just wanted to cover a little bit about the landscape that we're dealing with, because it does have a relevance to how we need to focus on our response. And this is a slide I often use because I think it's quite important to look at how cyber attacks, cyber crime and cyber security, how it's evolved over time. A long time ago, even before Simon and I were actually involved in cyber security, it wasn't really, I think, if you like, there was lack of dependency on digital systems like we have today. Hacks at the time were really about notoriety. It was more of a hobby. And then when I started to get into my first role in cybersecurity, we started to have the I Love You virus, Code Red, and there were a number of fairly high-profile attacks that started to appear on the scene. And what was interesting about these was that they were successful largely for one main reason, and that was because they involved a lot of social engineering that initiated individuals and users to click on whatever it was that then initiated and implanted a malware or infection or whatever it was at the time. So we started to see around about this time, a shift, if you like, from the hobby kind of approach right the way through to, oh, this seems to be, a combination of techniques to be able to circumvent current security controls. Then things started to really get quite concerning. And these are just random data we put on here, but we started to see a significant increase in financial crime. Obviously, there was that whole sort of market dynamics of the supply and demand. And this is when we started to see organised attacks start to become very focused and often largely successful. And I think, to be honest with you, up until this time, preventative techniques largely worked. Okay, and I use that word prevention because obviously what we're talking here is a lot to do with how we respond. And so today, that's why the responsive techniques are incredibly important, because unfortunately, attacks are becoming much more sophisticated and they will continue to do so. And so we can't just think in a one-dimensional manner about prevent. We've got to think about how we prevent, how we can detect, and how we can respond. And when we do respond, making sure that we do so in a structured and timely manner to minimise impact.
And I think that's a great slide, actually, Nick, to share. I mean, I think when you and I both started in this area, if we'd even suggested that people would actually attack your fridge or your doorbell or your coffee machine, people probably would have thought we were insane at that point, wouldn't they?
Yeah, absolutely. Yeah, and as you say, I mean, everything is increasingly connected. So the actual threat landscape is becoming significantly larger than it was in 1988. One of the things that we do take quite, we often take a close look at are how organisations out there, such as the World Economic Forum, the UN, OECD, organisations of stature, I think is probably the best way of looking at it. And what is it they're seeing? Because we work with a lot of clients, work with a lot of vendors. Obviously, our world is cybersecurity, and sometimes you can be influenced with what vendors are saying. So, but it's pretty clear that World Economic Forum, even the Big Four, my last organisation I worked for, PwC, these are organisations that profile a huge number of clients, and they can come up with a pretty objective view in terms of roughly where does that cyber attack landscape or cyber risk landscape actually lie. And it is becoming a great concern with senior organisations, which in some ways is a good opportunity, because now that the senior level, the boards, they understand the significance of cyber risk, the emphasis is now on us, obviously, to be able to ensure that we've got adequate protection in place to both prevent and respond to a particular attack. But at the sort of centre of everything we're going to be talking about over the next 40-50 minutes is to ensure that we have a good grasp in terms of what those cyber risks, cyber attacks, cyber threats look like. And I'm not going to get into the taxonomy of which word means which, but we're talking about risk to the organisation from a cybersecurity attack. And okay, this is not a periodic table for chemistry. This is just a range of different threat types that we pull together. And I think what's really important here is let's not forget about the accidental threat. Okay, we come across this as a significant challenge. Unfortunately, there's less visibility in the media and the noise and from the vendors because it's not a particularly attractive threat to talk about. But we can't just think about those intentional threats. We also have to think about those user errors, if you like. But what is important, though, is that we need to be able to profile the risks before we determine how we're going to set up that response plan. So, a very simple analogy: if you go to the doctor should diagnose what the problem is before they then provide you with, the medication. It's exactly the same. We need to work out what those problems are. We then need to design the controls, both from a preventative and a responsive manner, in terms of how we're going to address those particular risks. So we'll cover this in more detail as we go through this. Simon, over to you.
Yeah, no, thanks for that background, Nick. And I think that that slide there with all the different threats there is a really interesting thing to kick off with, because I think if we talk about big business, so large organisation, etc., they tend to have quite a good handle on those threats, or at least an understanding of those threats. And I think the real challenge for smaller businesses is what's the appropriate level of understanding that they need. And I'm not going to sit here and read everything out because there's quite a lot of texticles on that screen there. But actually, first line is big and small organisations can be hit by cyber attacks, and that's a reality. of the situation as things stand. Now, a small business might take some decisions there about how much depth they're going to delve into. But at the end of the day, if it's your business and you've invested your livelihood into this business, if you're hit by an attack, that could still wipe your business out, whether it's an organisation that employs 10,000 people or 2 people. If that's your livelihood, this is a potential damage to you, which you need to think about. And as Nick mentioned about you've got the prevention, but then actually having a plan, and I've been around in this industry probably similar length of time as Nick. The old days of thinking, oh well, if there's an incident, we just deal with it, and that's not wrong, because you do, as anything in life that goes wrong, you just get on and deal with it. If you don't have a plan, that size of the problem would be so much bigger, and the negative impact on your organisation can be so much bigger. And this is a real benefit of having a plan which allows you to quickly and effectively respond to manage that incident or manage that data breach. The days of just saying, oh, we'll deal with it in a bit, or we'll do, and I remember running a workshop a number of years ago. Scarily, that's probably 20 years ago now, and there was a number of small business managers in there, and they're going, oh well, we just get on with it. If there's business continuity issues, we just get on with it. And of course, that's great. Until that one person who's driving it all happens to be on holiday, or they're off sick, or whatever. And it's important to understand what we protect here. You're looking to protect your customers ultimately, because you want to maintain your reputation so you can still provide a service to your clients. You still have a business left. But you're also protecting your assets as part of that. But the front-facing bit is really, really important. Don't underestimate the damage of reputation. Particularly if you work in certain sectors, reputation is so important to what you do that if there's a serious dent on that reputation, then your chances of growing that business is fairly minimal. And this is also driven by the contractual obligations. It might be legal and regulatory, particularly, I mean, the banking sector in the UK would be a good example there, where there is a heavy focus on cyber resilience, as well as obviously financial resilience. That what would happen if you ceased to function? What would happen if you lost critical systems? And it's understanding those vulnerabilities so you can remediate and prevent those attacks. So we all talk about security, and we quite often talk about security almost in isolation of the business. Now, absolute front and center of this is the business. You're protecting the business. You're not protecting information. Well, you are. But your first priority is you are protecting the business, and that's, for us as professionals, that's really, really important to have that front and center of our thinking. Don't think of it as protecting information. Really, you're protecting the business and the business reputation and your customers. And without any of those, as we all know, we don't have business. So if we look at the two standards side by side, Nick, if we can just fly on to that. And again, I'm not going to read this out. There's a hideous amount of text here, and I wanted to put this in here because I think that's useful when the slides, etc., are put out post webinar. You can perhaps go and have a look at these. But they're two very different standards, but yet they're almost the same, if that's not a contradictory statement there. ISO 27001 will allow you to step up your information security, make risk-based decisions about what's most important to you, what you've got budget to afford to do, understand your legal, contractual, and regulatory requirements. So the focus very much there is a systematic approach. That means you can do things thoroughly and carefully, that it's well considered. And any of you who've gone through ISO certification previously will know that it doesn't seem well considered when you're a few days out from the assessment time, because that's when everything starts need to doing. But that's what the plan is. It's a systematic approach there. You can understand your risk. You've got a good grasp of what assets you've got. You've got a good understanding of what risks you hold, and you do something about it. 22301 is about business continuity. So if you look at, there's some fairly subtle changes in some of the languages from the two sides here. So one side provides a framework for implementing, maintaining, continually improving an ISMS, and it's a BCMS. So if you look at the two standards side by side, there is a great amount of similarity in the first half. So if you've got one standard, if you've got 27001, it's a possibility to make that transition relatively, I say relatively straightforward. And in fact, many organisations who will do certification for you will actually do a discounted rate for doing both at the same time because of those similarities. Obviously, it's up to you as an organisation whether you want the disruption of doing both at the same time, but there is that option there. But if you look at the information, some of the text on here, it talks about critical business function. So it's a move away from information into business function. And it includes things like natural disaster, as well as cyber attacks and human errors. Nick sort of mentioned there the accidental aspect, which is not always particularly well considered in my experience, because it isn't that thing that's really interesting, and you can't have a picture of a guy with a hoodie on as the bad guy, and you can't talk about nation state. You know, we're all human, we all make mistakes, and that's also what we're helping to protect against. This standard helps protect against. And I'll be really interested if anyone's got any questions on these two standards actually as we go forward, because these two standards are actually really interested in that regard, but they are very much hold hands together. Mm-hmm. So Nick, will we move on, or is this you next? I can't remember now. Are you any questions on? I'm sure you must have something to say on this slide.
Well, before we move on, I just want to touch on a few of the changes with the standards and the regulatory landscape that we see. As Simon mentioned, you know, there's a greater focus on ensuring you adopt this risk-based approach. So compliance is still going to be important. We're not saying compliance isn't, but you know, we are seeing a lot of organizations moving from the tick, 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 tick kind of approach through to, before we work out what controls we need, let's work out what our risk profile is. And don't get me wrong, as developing a risk profile for your organization, it is going to be subjective. You're not going to be 100% right. In fact, you're never going to be 100% right because of the change in the dynamics and obviously subjective nature. But it is far more effective than just applying a flat level of controls across your organization. You do need to understand and try and diagnose what those types of risks are to the organization. And I'll suggest, or we'll suggest, some ideas on how you can do that. The other point to highlight.
Sorry, Nick. Sorry, if I could just interject there. I think that's a really interesting point, this move from compliance-based to risk. And I think for me, one of the key drivers of that process is compliance is very one-dimensional, and you tick those boxes that you've got X, Y, Z. But as we all know, with the slide that Nick showed earlier, the threat landscape is big, and you probably aren't going to have enough budget to do everything that you would like to do.
Yeah.
The reality is, whereas a risk-based approach will allow you to focus in on the things that you worry about most.
Yeah, exactly. And the last point I was going to say is this is also how regulation are now articulating a lot of their requirements. So we see a lot of regulation, especially in the telco sector, the oil and gas sector, and the finance sector. And we're seeing some of these regulations now becoming really quite specific about adopting this risk-based approach. And I think the other side, there may be a number of you who are talking about the fact that you may be thinking about how difficult it is sometimes to get budget. And I'm not saying that this is a silver bullet, but what you can do and establish, and what we see is often the case with a risk-based approach, is you can start to produce that traceability in terms of why you need controls in place, why you need budget to support that. So if things do go wrong, at least you've got that traceability to be able to say, told you so. But anyway,
that's really interesting, Nick. There, sorry about the budget, and maybe that's a subject for another webinar, maybe about how to have those conversations. Again, my experience just going to the board and trying to scare them does not produce budget. It's a much more nuanced conversation around that, and it focuses on things like organizational resilience, not how many threats are out there, because we could scare everybody with the numbers of threats that there are out there and how strong they are, etc. So it's a more nuanced conversation, but that resilience conversation is a much more rich conversation, and organizations in my experience, tend to get that more than just we've stopped so many things at the firewall, which is kind of almost irrelevant, really.
Yeah, yeah, indeed. Okay, so we have a poll.
Yes, okay, I'll launch the poll now.
Thank you, Lisa.
While the audience can see the question and also the answers in the slide.
Okay. And I don't know if we're going to see the results.
I'm sure they'll pop up in a second.
I'll tell the results.
Okay, perfect. Thank you.
Yeah.
So if you can provide your responses.
I'm looking forward to seeing how many you put down C.
Okay, we have 44% that answered the A option, 28% that answered B option, and 28% answered C option.
So, Simon, what do you think?
That's really encouraging, because I'm fairly certain if we'd asked this question 3 years ago, it probably would have been the other way around, don't you think? I mean, I think if people understand prioritise cyber risk, that's a huge step, certainly from when you and I started working together 5 or 6 years ago.
Yeah, I have to say that's really good to see. And I think, we purposely put it in regular practice with senior management for the obvious reason that, everyone in the organisation needs to get a sense of how serious, a major attack could be. So that's really good to see. Fantastic. Okay, right. So now we're going to talk about what we need for a response plan, and then we're going to get into how to actually develop it. So what we've done is, Simon and I have spent quite a bit of time thinking about this and how to sort of boil this down in terms of our own experience and what we think works really effectively. So basically, we've got 3 key steps we're going to be talking about in more detail. And step 1 is, as Simon referred to earlier, understanding within the organisation what is critical to the business. So call these crown jewels, call them critical mission applications, whatever it is, but understanding, firstly, what is critical for the organisation to achieve its strategic objectives. And then we'll talk about a sort of a top-down approach on how you can achieve that. Once we understand what is critical and what are those critical information assets or data assets, that's when we start to look at how we can profile and assess and evaluate and prioritise those risks from a cybersecurity perspective. And again, we'll go through a sort of a process on how you would achieve that. It's a qualitative approach, but again, talk about how you would achieve that. Once you understand what's critical, once you understand your key risks, effectively you diagnose some of the key problems to what are critical to the organisation. Then you're in step 3, which is right, now we can design a response plan that conforms to both those risks and those critical assets. It sounds very simple at a high level, and I'll go through in terms of the hints and tips and approaches to achieve that. But this, if you keep those 3 elements in mind, you can't really go too far wrong with creating a response plan that works, because as obvious as it may sound, this is something that has to work when there's a huge amount of chaos and people are looking around at each other to see how actually we're going to respond once our customers are phoning up saying they can't get access to that system and this system, and you suddenly realise you're under an attack from a cybersecurity challenge. So, okay, so just a couple of hints and tips just to get started here. As Simon mentioned, we won't be able to protect all data assets. Even if you're a small organisation, it's just not achievable. So we've got to work out a smart way of determining which of those data assets are key for us to be able to protect. Very obvious, I know, but sometimes just agreeing and just accepting that I can't provide 100% protection, that's okay. In cybersecurity, you can't do that. And if any organisation says they've got all of their data assets in their organisation completely protected, it's not true. The next one here is to start understanding some of the key characteristics of your organisation. You know, are you largely, you know, an on-prem? Is your IT largely on-prem and your information assets maybe outsourced to a third-party vendor? You can even start thinking about, okay, if we were to look at confidentiality, protecting integrity, protecting availability, what would we say is probably most important to the organisation? So you could be a retailer, for example, and both confidentiality and availability may be important. You may be part of the critical national infrastructure that's supplying energy. Well, availability is probably going to be particularly important today. Once we understand some of those characteristics, then let's think about how we're going to approach this and come up with a good view of those risks. And profiling the risks is not just about coming up with a response plan that conforms to those risks. There's lots of additional benefits that will help you know, achieve for the broader security program. If anything, can create awareness around senior management. Yes, the sort of fourth bullet point here. Okay, we need to be able to practice our response to a cyber attack. And that cyber attack should be determined and influenced by the risk we identify. But practicing that response has to involve a range of different individuals in the organisation. And it's not just a security team, it's not just a C-level individual. It could be your PR spokesperson, because you may be an organisation that there's a tap on the door from the media. You need to start thinking about how and what is the right way to respond to such a potential scenario. So let's start off with, okay, step one. How are we going to go about looking at determining what is critical to our organisation? So there's a very simple example here. That's, you know, talking here maybe about a retailer. Business objective here maybe to, and this is the, you know, business strategic objective. We need to reduce cost of sales, and there's a business process to help achieve that. And there's a series of steps that are involved in that particular process with regards to online ordering for customers. This is an effective way of starting to understand, okay, what is the key objective for the organisation? What are the processes that enable that objective to occur? What are the systems that enable that process to operate? So you can start to drill down and make that link to the area that we're familiar with, which is what are those critical information assets? You may start to profile those particular assets or systems, and you might start to then aggregate and derive some of the key risk themes. Okay, as I said before, this is not an exact science when you're profiling risk, but it is an effective way of starting to get a better informed view in terms of the types of things that can go wrong from a cybersecurity perspective. And there may be lots of aspects about those risks that again link to your organisation. So we're talking here in this example about online ordering for customers. So you may have, you know, credit card information, personal information. You may be prone to a ransomware attack because availability of this particular process is so important. And, you know, as part of these risks and part of the scenarios, you may want to ask, would we pay a ransom? So understanding that link between the risks and the systems and that business objective is important to get established. Now, another approach here, again, these are just ideas that we use when we engage with organizations to work out what's critical. And this is probably very familiar to a lot of you. This is a business impact assessment or criticality assessment. And, you know, the idea here is to look at the types of impacts that are applicable to your organization, obviously financial, reputation, regulatory, to work out a gradation of those types of impacts, and then work out what what a moderate reputational impact could look like, what a very high financial impact could look like. And populating this table is something that I would recommend all of you to do, because it's a very useful tool to engage the business. Because what you're establishing here is, okay, if we're going to start thinking about the business and start looking at the criticality of information assets for our organization, we need to know the level of criticality from a business perspective. And this is a very useful vehicle for helping you to achieve that. As I say, this is, you know, ideally something you'd fill out as a one-time exercise. Sit down with the CFO, sit down with the Chief Operating Officer, whoever it is, and look at how well you can start to build that content as part of this way of assessing critical assets.
And it helps you talk in the language the business understands. I've seen organisations that have tried to do this within the security team, and of course, you're not the right people to do that. It does mean going out there and talking to the business, say, okay, what really matters to you? How can we define this? And I think they're really great conversations because it brings security closer together with the business, and there's never a loss when you do that, to help embed the security aspects deep into the business.
Okay, so once we've established that understanding of those critical assets, and as I said, there's a number of options. We presented two ways that we see organisations do this fairly effectively with a business-driven approach. Then it comes into the ball lands in our part of the pitch, which is, okay, how are we going to start understanding and profiling the risks? So, you know, 27005, NIST 837, there's lots of standards out there, and they largely conform to this kind of approach, which we take as well. So, you know, by all means, take a screenshot of this if you don't have a step-by-step plan of the cyber risk process. This is broadly the right way of doing a cyber risk assessment. So, and as I say, it's a qualitative approach. There are quantitative approaches as well. First is understand, okay, now we understand what is a critical asset. Let's create that as the target profile. Let's start to work out what the potential business impact is. You may want to use that business impact form as a way of being able to rate that. Because remember, you know, you're going to look at the criticality from a business perspective, but there may be systems that are more important to enable that process to run than others. So it's worth doing that impact assessment on all those assets that support that business or strategic objective, just to work out and prioritise which are most critical. The next one then is obviously assessing the cyber threats, and you know, that's probably, some of these steps can be webinars within themselves, and assessing the vulnerability to those threats. And that's the order within which I would recommend that you take that, okay? Because if you understand what the cyber threats are, then you're in a position then to say, well, these are the key controls to stop that threat from occurring, and they should be the controls that you assess to understand your level of vulnerability and exposure. And then, because you've assessed the impact, the threats, and the vulnerability, that's the classic equation to then determine the cyber risk. And then you're in the process of looking at remediation. And when you're looking at cyber risk remediation, this is not just a straightforward activity of, okay, these are the key risks, these are the key remediating controls in place, that's what we need. It's important to think about the budget that's available. It's important to think about the current skill set. So before you select a highly sophisticated control, let's work out how much disruption that's going to cause, how much support that's going to cause, because you know, there's nothing worse than spending a lot of money on what you've said is a key control, but you don't have that ability to implement it effectively and operate it. So that's a broad overview of the actual sort of risk process that we typically follow. Yes, one thing I wanted to highlight, there is if the number of organisations that listen to this are thinking about adopting this risk-based approach, and you want some way of measuring your current capability, take a note of the web link below. It's a very simple set of questions, takes you 5 minutes. Provides a recommendation report with some really good ideas and information on how you should mature in this space. So I'll come back to that towards the end if you missed the link. But that's the risk-based process. So we're now in a situation where we've figured out what's critical to the organisation for our response plan. So that's the scope of our response plan. We understand what those risks are, so we may be focusing around risks to do with, denial of service attack. We may have risks to do with accidental, errors. We may have issues to do with exfiltration of personal information, and these are all important to understand because it will determine and influence the type of response that we're going to carry out. So, if the focus is around protecting availability, then obviously we need to practice how we're going to switch over to, maybe to a hot site. If the focus is on confidentiality and risks to exfiltration of that confidential data, maybe personal information, maybe intellectual property, then there are responses that may need to engage external law enforcement or your Information Commissioner Office, for example, if you're under GDPR. And these are the things that we have to consider. This is not just about how we're going to respond and manage it internally. There may be other factors that are involved, notifying customers and clients, for example. But a number of the key elements that you should at least consider for your response plan here. Number one, communication plan. Who is it we're going to contact when systems start going down? Processes are not operating effectively. The Security Operations Centre has identified there is a cyber attack. Who are the external parties we're going to consider? Do we need to start preparing our response from a public relations perspective? Are there senior managers that need to think about the tier 1 clients that need to be contacted to ensure that, yes, we've had a cyber attack, excuse me, it's, we've got it under control, we know what's going on. Just another quick one here, that it's becoming increasingly significant for organizations to develop as part of a response plan a forensic capability. So you might want to think about how you're going to protect what we call the chain of custody. So how you protect the information to ensure that the integrity of that information is sound, should it go to prosecution. So there are a number of the key areas that should be considered in a response plan. Simon, any thoughts on that one?
No, I think that's a great list. It's interesting you mentioned about sort of forensic and preservation of evidence. My sort of suggestion would always be to smaller organisations is that you can outsource that kind of capability, and I think that's worth considering, because that can be, you might not need it very often, but that can be really painful when you do need it. And just an observation for me really about how you manage when there's an incident in terms of your external, maybe your clients or your customer base. My experience has always been, and obviously tell me in the comments if yours is different, but customers tend to be moderately understanding that things go wrong. So if you're a good company and you're giving a good service, they will be quite forgiving that something goes wrong. But if you don't communicate effectively, they won't forgive you, because it's almost like you're trying to hide it. So actually this engagement piece is so important, and that the way you phrase it, the way you term it, it's the world we live in. Everybody knows that cyber incidents happen everywhere. And, we've all been victims at some point. But being really positive and going on the front foot for some of these things is really, really helpful, rather than making it feel like you're trying to bury it. Would be my advice. Again, this is where we need to work with the rest of the businesses as security folk. We need to get the comms team in and make sure they're comfortable and confident with doing that, what messages they're putting out, because that's their bread and butter. So yeah, really think about that. I mean, I know that's Nick's got that down as a red box, a must-have, and that'd almost be a must-have for me, really.
Good, thank you. Okay, I think Simon, this was your slide, is it?
Yeah, just some further hints and tips here about simulate the risks of critical assets via work. So tabletop exercises. Again, this is, when I first came into this industry, people didn't tend to do those, or if they did, they were really big deals. Again, Nick, I don't know if you remember back to when we started doing these, and it was almost like, well, what kind of witchcraft are you bringing to our table here that we have to think about these things? Now, there's lots of great resources out there. Certainly in the UK, there's the National Cybersecurity Centre, so NCSC, have a toolkit for running some of these exercises. And they can be really simple. Some of these things you can run in half an hour, so they don't have to be as disruptive as perhaps you think they are. Understand your control weaknesses, and there has to be a certain degree of honesty here, and acknowledge where things aren't as good as you'd like them to be. And every organisation will have things that aren't as good as they'd like them to be, and if they tell you they're perfect, they're probably being slightly dishonest. So just understand what that looks like. Senior stakeholders, you can't do any of this stuff without the business, without senior stakeholders. You can't do this in isolation in the security team. This has to be something broader than that. The real benefit is that these can be great opportunities to work with the wider business. And I've never had a negative impact, a negative response to that. Most people want the security team to be more close to the heart of the business, and this is your opportunity to do that. If you're going to design an exercise for practicing, put some things in there that, because the things go wrong during this, we use the term the fog of war. Things go wrong. People make a diagnosis of something being the problem, and actually the problem isn't that, it's something else. Or if it's bad guys, the bad guys may have put a hint in there that it's something that it's not. And it's actually getting that critical thinking right. They go, okay, well, hang on a minute, we're acting on an assumption here. What is that? And anchor yourself to that. What are we really doing, and why are we doing that? And I love the next one about ransomware. Now, I would never ask anybody on a call whether they will pay ransom or not, but every time you run an exercise and you ask that question, everyone always sits there and says, no, we'd never do that. Morally, it's wrong. And I think we'd probably all agree with that. However, if you're a medium-sized business, and if you pay the ransom, you think you're going to get your data back to allow you to deliver your big order tomorrow, which means you can satisfy payroll at the end of the week, the temptation is real. So there's some real honest conversations there about that, because people do pay ransoms. You quick Google will show you a load of news stories where people are saying we're going to pay the ransom because we think that's our way out. But you should have that conversation in an exercise and have an honest conversation about it. And it really is the value there. And as Nick mentioned earlier about the accidental threats, things do go wrong. Things happen that you don't plan to, because not for anything malicious, but just consider that anything accidental can happen there. It could be as simple as someone working on a server and making some wrong calls. That can take you offline. And I'll probably offer one more here. Don't make the assumption that because you're putting things into the cloud that everything's taken care for you. You will still have to do activity, and you will still have to communicate, because it's your business. It's not AWS or Azure's business. It's your business still. So you will still have activity to do there. And again, there is a bit of an assumption that, oh, well, if it's in the cloud, we don't have to worry too much. And while some of the pain is taken away, you will still have to do something there.
On that last point, I think that's a really good point. And just to emphasize that third party engagement, I still come across senior stakeholders and organizations with the mindset that they've outsourced the service, therefore they've outsourced the risk. Not the case. You still own the risk. And I think the other point to highlight around this third party piece here is that, whatever threat report you look at, third party suppliers are a major target, because ultimately, they hold the keys to many kingdoms. So, be very careful about that. And of course, we're talking here about the response, capability. So make sure you understand both from a practical point of view, but also contractually, how it is that they will respond to you. Because if they notify yourself within the time frame, if it's a breach of personal information, you're then on the hook to report that to the Relative Information Commissioner's office. So it's important to understand that connection with the third party. They can't just be left to carry on with what they do from a cybersecurity perspective. Okay.
That's a great point, Nick. I'm just being aware of the time. So I'll slides will be shared with you sort of post-event and be available to you. But we looked at put together a small case study of online retailer selling a number of items. They rely heavily on their website and database, so to store customer information, process orders, and manage your inventory. Again, not untypical in the current where the world currently works. So they've made a decision there. They're going to go for 27,001 and 22,301. And Nick, if we move on to the next slide, yeah. So they want to use 27,001 to protect their most valuable assets. They've identified them, they've assessed what risks there are, and they've implemented the relevant security measures to protect against or mitigate those risks. So they've used encryption, they've used firewalls, all the kind of stuff that you guys know, because this is what you do for a living. And they've established procedures for instant response, disaster recovery, and business continuity. So this is their leaping off point for them. And their solution, so they've done lots of protective work with 27,001. 22,301 is to ensure that they have good business continuity in place and it's effective in supporting the business. They've identified what their critical functions are and what the process, and developed a comprehensive business continuity plan. Now, if you start doing this, if you start looking at critical assets, critical processes, critical systems, there's no easy way of doing it. You've got to start somewhere. And I've recently been working with an organisation on a problem very similar to this. And it's that difficulty of understanding you have to start somewhere. So you've got to start at the beginning. There's no way of shortcutting that. There's no easy way for that. And they've got plans there to make sure they can step things up. And they've got backups in place. They can communicate with their clients and their customers. And Nick, if we move on to the last, next slide. So off the back of that, they're protecting their most valuable assets, and they're pretty confident they can recover quickly from any disruptions. This means their customers' data is secure. Customers always like secure data, and things can run smoothly if things aren't going quite right. So it may well be you might have a development and a test environment and a production environment. Well, actually, your priority is going to be production because that's what pays the bills. You might be able to live without your test environment for a few days, but you need to have those conversations about what's most important to you. And as a result of that, they maintain their trust with their customers and partners, and they continue to grow their business. And I know that's a really simple 5-minute whistle stop about a case study, but it gives you a bit of a flow about how they all link together. And that's important to have that understanding about the difference between the two standards there. But again, any questions on that'd be fantastic. So poll 2, if we're able to get the poll started, it'd be great.
Yes, I'll start the poll now.
Thank you. So what is your #1 cybersecurity risk? So is it complete loss of, so A is complete loss of availability to key systems? Is it B, a major data breach? Again, this might depend on what your business sector you work in. Or C, corruption of critical data. So what do you think is your #1 security risk? Which would keep you awake at night the most?
And we've been quite vague in describing this risk. Obviously, you can read into this as a focus around CI&A. Obviously, a bit of a hint there, but it'd be interesting just to get a sense of where your risk actually lies.
Yeah, that's a great point actually, Nick, because we quite often, quite tempting, isn't it? People focus a huge amount of efforts and confidentiality, but actually availability might be most important to their clients.
Okay, we have 33% that voted the A option, 44% for the B option, and 23% C option.
Yeah, that's pretty much what I thought in terms of the priority of confidentiality. B would be still the most important, and there may be a big focus on that with regards to GDPR and making sure that privacy of customers is key.
Yep.
Availability, and then C, which is really about integrity. That's actually slightly higher, if I'm honest with you, 23%. But yeah, that's broad.
I could do a webinar just on these three topics, really, Nick. So I think that's really interesting. Is that, you know, actually the quality of data is really, really important, but we tend to focus on confidentiality most. And I've never quite understood. It's funny when we talk about key assets. That sort of personal information can actually trump everything else. And actually, for a business, yes, it's important, but it's not the most important.
That's right. That's right. I mean, we may get some complaints from the Information and Commissioner Office saying this, but you're right. I quite often will, you know, carry out these types of activities, and when organisations look at it, yeah, it's really not great to have a data breach. But sometimes it's not always the crown jewel of the organisation. That's just the reality.
I've never done a crown jewels, and we've actually come out that the most important information is personally identifiable. And maybe I've just been lucky or unlucky in who I've done those with, but that's just a personal experience. It's important, but it's not top tier.
Yeah. Okay. Okay. I think we can both take this. Simon, I think, right, so this is our last slide before we get to the Q&A. So it's really just a repeat of those three key steps. And as I said, you know, we could probably spend 1 or 2 webinars on each of them, but we've only got an hour. So as I said before, work out what are those critical assets in your organisation. Think about the right approach to take. Top-down approach may not always work. You may have, you know, senior individuals that are very resistant about getting into this world of cyber risk. So don't bother. You know, you may want to start looking at that, you know, critical impact reference table we showed you as a way of starting to make those individuals aware rather than start off and getting them heavily involved. But we need to work out what those critical assets are, because it will influence the priority and how we actually go about protecting them. The middle one here, again, working out what those risks are. And I know sometimes risk assessment, risk evaluation seems like a dark art, but it's not. If you follow those key steps, it will lead you to a better understanding and also create that traceability in terms of how you come up with those particular risks. And maybe in the future we can take a much deeper dive into, you know, some kind of masterclass on conducting practical risk assessments using that approach. Once you've got that, you understand the critical assets, which forms the scope, you understand the risk, which forms your response and influences how you're going to respond, and they are key inputs into your response plan. But as Simon and I have said all along, you have to practice that response plan. It can't just be a document that gathers dust and sits on a bookshelf. It has to be practiced, and you need to go through this as often as you can, really. You know, there is no set time in terms of do we do it every year, do we do it every quarter? That's up to you, but it should be practiced. Simon, anything from yourself before we get to the
No, just because we're sort of running short of time now, but all I'd really say is that with all these things, certainly things like identification, you know, don't let perfection be a barrier. You won't get it right first time. You won't be 100% right, but you need to start somewhere. But don't worry about that. You know, over time you'll refine that and finesse it, and you'll get it close to what you want. Same with risk. You won't be, well, you might be right first time, but it's pretty unlikely, and that's really important. Don't let that be a barrier to start the process. Don't be scared of the process. The process is what you learn from, not necessarily the outputs.
Great.
Okay. Thank you, Simon and Nick, for delivering this very informative webinar. Without further ado, we'll go ahead and take some time to answer some of the questions from the attendees. The first question is, how can we ensure our cyber response plan against cyber crime attacks is effective?
Well,
Practice. Isn't it?
I think, yeah, I mean, it is absolutely about practicing it. But I think one of the things you can do with understanding, so the word cybercrime is quite a big, you know, it's potentially a big scope. So are we talking, you know, one of the questions that we need to answer here are we talking about cybercrime where it's an insider threat? You know, there's collusion between a party outside the organisation and individuals in the organisation. that does occur more often than we often think. The second thing is understanding, again, using that risk-based approach. So what are the control weaknesses that could lead to that cybercrime occurring? Once we understand those control gaps, then that should give us good information in terms of what we need to fix. If the ability to fix those is not there, then that's when it becomes practicing our response to that is important. And just again, when we think about whatever risk it is, but let's take this cybercrime, let's assume it could be a ransomware, which is very common. It's well worth thinking about what are the controls in place from the ability to prevent it, to detect it, and to respond to it. I know this presentation is all about a response plan, but we do need to think still about putting efforts in preventing it. If they get past that layer of controls, we need to ensure we've got the ability to detect it so we can respond quickly and minimize the time, and we can prepare for our response. So that's kind of a rounded way of answering the question, but hopefully adds a little bit of light to that.
But what I would add to that, Nick, is and not saying it because we're consultants, but there is a real value from bringing somebody externally to help you with practicing cyber exercises, because they look at it from a different direction, and they can challenge perhaps senior management in a way that you probably can't, or you possibly can't. Plus, they're great fun to do as well, to be honest. But yeah, so always keep that open mind that somebody with a fresh pair of eyes can spot something that you perhaps haven't seen because you're just too close to it.
Yeah.
Okay, thank.
Well, sorry, guys. I was going to say we can answer these followed. But,
yes. Okay. The other question is, can we use the risk management of ISO 2701 to ISO 22301, or it should be tailored to cover both standards?
Simon?
Yes, you can. I would suggest reviewing the two. Because then one is primarily focused on information and information systems, and one is more focused on business. However, there's no point in, I've had this conversation many times about information security or cyber risk. There's almost no such thing. All there is risk or business risk. So if you can bring it together, great, because you don't want to be running multiple risk registers. You can bring them together. There's quite a neat mapping there, and it's quite closely aligned.
I think just to add to that, I think if you're going for certification for 27001 or 23,000, it's not 20. You don't get certified in 2301. You get certified in 23000. They would not look or expect a major difference between the two approaches for assessing risk. Because largely there is one approach to assessing risk, which is looking at the impact and determining the likelihood. And if you've got a robust approach to determining those two components, then you're going to be in a safe place.
Thank you, Nick and Simon. Okay, another question is, what are the KPI incident response metrics that we can use to be effective?
I'll certainly throw in a few here. I think that's a good question, actually. Firstly, having KPIs that measures your response, to me, is an indication that you're in a good place, because you're starting to think about how we can measure our response capability. But just to decompose those KPIs, the ones that I can think of off the top of my head would be things like, the extent to which senior stakeholders are engaged. It's important that we get that level engaged. I think the frequency within which they're carried out. I think what's also important is the extent to which you understand where change is needed. It's not a negative thing to suddenly realize, oh, we've got a lot of things to do to be able to respond more effectively. I'm going to go through a few here. The other I think is important is to look at the amount of change to the controls that are needed to respond for each exercise. So if you're an organization that's practicing this on a quarterly basis, and you're in touch with the changes in your risk profile, because the cyber risk profile of your organization is dynamic, will change. So if your response plans are changing at an equal measure, to me, that's a hugely positive level of maturity that you've got with measuring it from a KPI perspective. I probably missed out some really obvious ones, so Simon, I'll let you jump in.
Yeah, no, things like the availability, for example, if availability is important to your business, that will be a KPI for how quickly you can get up and running again. And I know that might seem quite a crude measure, but given the level of monitoring and logging that we have available often now, particularly on things like cloud storage, you probably know there's an incident before your customers know there's an incident, because the monitoring is so good. So it could be quite. Again, this KPI, this would be, again, another great topic for another webinar, Nick. But yeah, I mean, that's a good spread there. But I would make sure that if you're going to look at KPIs, make sure that you engage with the wider business. So what is important to them, not necessarily what you think as a cyber professional, what's important. What does the business think is most important? And again, Nick and I have had many conversations with sort of C-level management around that topic, about making sure you only give KPIs for what really matters to them, not everything else.
Yeah, and just one quick one to add, which I think is important, is, you know, keep a, I mean, it could be a KPI, could be just an activity, but keep a tab on social media. You know, sometimes clients and customers are the first to identify where there's a problem, and it'll be very loud and you'll know about it. So it's often a useful source of threat intelligence, if you like, to monitor what's going on and, you know, issues clients may raise.
Okay, thanks for your answers. And the last question for today, are there any templates which could be provided to kickstart a cybersecurity plan?
Oh, I'll tell you what I'll do. I will see what's publicly available, potentially what we could share at CRMG, and I'll include that as part of the, you know, the response to the broader set of questions. How about that? I don't expect one of 800 of you to be able to, or 600 to be able to respond, but that's I think basically that's certainly something we can put in there. You know, that's sort of a skeleton template in terms of response.
Yes, of course. Yes, we can do that. Okay, thanks Nick and Simon once again for delivering the webinar. Thanks to everyone who joined us today. Just one information, this session is recorded and it will be posted on our website and YouTube channel along with the slides of the presentation. Thanks again one more time for you both.